So, South Korea might have just had a coup. Yes, hello, my friends, Tucker here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. You might have heard recently that there's been a bit of drama concerning South Korea. The whole thing brings up a very interesting question. What exactly is martial law, and why the hell did the South Korean president try to invoke it? What exactly does this mean for the people of South Korea, and how did the incident actually play out? At the same time, how could this happen in one of the most historically strong democracies of the last 30 years? Well, my friends, join us as we talk about exactly what happened and how South Korea ended up here. Because this whole thing is a gigantic mess filled with all kinds of twists and turns that I did not expect going into this in the first place. But as always, we're going to need to dive into some context in the first place. But my friends, before it is that we explain all of that, there is something else that has also been going on here. This past year or so, we've seen a number of high-profile security breaches. And so it's a good thing that this video is sponsored by Aura. Fairly recently, National Public Data would go and announce that they had suffered a major breach, potentially impacting every single American. The incident would compromise over 2.9 billion records used for background checks, including critical personal information such as full names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, and most importantly, social security numbers. I'm saying this right now, but if you who is watching this have not actually taken steps in order to be able to protect yourself from these kinds of leaks, to protect yourself from information of yourself and your family being exposed online, you need to do that because now it is more important in this day and age than ever before. Considering everything that it is that I talk about on my varying different channels, I have been come after by varying different extreme groups of different political and economic ideologies. But thankfully, because I use today's sponsor, Aura, I'm actually able to feel more secure about things. Aura goes and monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of different data points like the dark web and public court records in order to alert you about potential identity theft. Even if something does happen, they also provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance in case that goes down. Considering everything it is that I have been through over the past several years, including a really big incident that I experienced in 2022, which almost shut me down from being able to create anything myself that I do now, I can't mess around with this kind of stuff here anymore. I can't. Please, by all means, go and click my link down in the description and get yourself a 2-week subscription of Aura for free. You can try it out. Even if you don't keep things, that is at least enough time to find out through Aura if your data has been exposed already. It is worth it to just check, and I want to make sure that everyone who follows me here is actually safe. Thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video and also protecting me and my family. Now back to the show. First off, let's go ahead and start by addressing the first question regarding the whole situation that some people may be asking first. Just what exactly is martial law? Well, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, martial law involves the temporary substitution of military authority for civilian rule and is usually invoked in a time of war, rebellion, or natural disaster. Basically, when martial law is in effect, the military commander of an area or country has pretty much unlimited authority to make and enforce laws in that region. Martial law is justified when civilian authority has ceased to function. It is completely absent, or it's become ineffective. It just does not work anymore. Furthermore, martial law goes and suspends all existing laws, as well as civil authority and ordinary administration of justice. So imagine pretty much everyone's shock when on December 3rd, 2024, which yes, I know at this point it's like a week past, but I wanted to wait and see how all this played out before it is that I made a video on this. Imagine people's shock when South Koreans watching late night TV were interrupted by the president coming onto TV at 10:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time to share a new development. After reading a pre-written address to the people where he stated that he had to protect the country from North Korean communists and eliminate anti-state elements, he continued on by then stating a need to, quote, rebuild and protect the country from falling into ruin. I mean, really, the entire thing when he was describing this was very vague and ambiguous, and there is probably a key reason for that. See, in the case of South Korea's martial law, President Yoon Suk-yeol would go and read out Proclamation Number 1, the decree of martial law, on the television broadcast. This wasn't just your standard entry-level martial law declaration, which I don't really know how it is that I would describe that here in the first place. Yoon's version had all kinds of stipulations that went with it, which perhaps it's better to just list out these stipulations for you so that you get exactly what it is that I mean, because there's really only 5 or 6 bullet points here, and the proclamation reads as follows. First off, under Proclamation Number 1, the martial law decree, effective as of 11 p.m. Korean Standard Time, the following measures have been implemented. 1. All political activities, including the operations of the National Assembly, local assemblies, political parties, political associations, gatherings, and protests, are prohibited. 2. Any act that denies or attempts to subvert the democratic system is prohibited, including fake news, manipulation of public opinion, and false incitement. 3. All media and publications are subject to the control of martial law command. 4. Acts of social disruption, such as strikes, slowdowns, or gatherings, are prohibited. 5. All medical personnel, including interns who are on strike or have left their medical posts, must return to their duties within 48 hours and serve diligently. Violators will be punished under the Martial Law Act. 6. Except for anti-state forces and those attempting to subvert the system, innocent citizens will be provided with measures to minimize disruptions to their daily lives. Any violators of the proclamation can be arrested, detained, searched, and seized without a warrant and will be punished according to Article 14 of the Martial Law Act. Yeah, if some of these things kind of stand out as a little bit odd, such as that part about the whole medical personnel thing and not being allowed to go on strike, yeah, that whole thing is a reference to the ongoing healthcare industry strikes that are occurring in South Korea, which are so complicated and messy that it would take a whole other video just to explain that. Because I say this right now, I know at the time that I'm making this, the whole thing has happened within the United States and the assassination of the healthcare CEO. I am probably going to have to do a video on health insurance now, because of course. But South Korea has been going through it as well, just with their own kind of issue. Either way, the stipulations listed here in the martial law were extra harsh and limited the government and press from doing their jobs. The question at that point remains to be answered: why did President Yoon declare martial law in the first place? Why would he go to such extreme lengths? Well, there are multiple reasons, but perhaps it's better to really look at the motives and history of the president himself so that people understand what exactly it is that they were dealing with. We are not going to cover everything, but it is important to establish this guy's background so that you understand where it is that we are today. President Yoon Suk-yeol was born in Seoul, Korea in 1960. He avoided Korea's compulsory military service with a medical waiver for, well, it's an issue I'm probably going to have a difficult time pronouncing here in the first place. Hold on, so I'm going to just try and put it above me here right now. Anisometropia. Did I say that right? I might have said it right. I don't know at this point. To explain it more simply, this is a condition where each of a person's eyes have greatly different refractive ability, so it's something that would affect a soldier's ability to see, which is kind of a problem, when you have to handle a firearm. He passed the first part of the bar exam to be a lawyer in his 4th year of university, but then, interestingly enough, took a staggering 9 more years to pass the second part of the exam. Either way, though, he would get into law, starting his career at the Daegu Public Prosecutor's Office in 1994. What is so fascinating, especially considering what it is that we're going to be talking about here today, is that he would even go and head the Special Branch and Central Investigation Department, which handled corruption cases. Yeah, I described the whole thing as interesting, but this is arguably probably the saddest part of this entire story, because for the next 20 years, what this guy did was devote himself to exposing and prosecuting government corruption, which is a laudable effort. And it is especially ironic that his most high-profile cases are those involving prosecuting presidents. Like, yes, the presidents of South Korea. As an example, in the year 2008, he was part of an independent counsel team that looked into a massive embezzlement and stock manipulation scheme between a company called BBK and then-president Lee Myung-bak. Then, in the year 2013, he led a special investigation team that uncovered evidence that the National Intelligence Service, which is Korea's version of the CIA basically, that they were attempting to manipulate public opinion in order to help Park Geun-hye to get elected president. At the time that this happened, he would recommend that the former head of the NIS, Won Se-hoon, be prosecuted for violating the Public Official Election Act. And it's worth noting that he actually got demoted for this recommendation at the time. It would appear that, at this point in his history, Yoon Suk-yeol still had his heart in the right place, and he was committed to the people and obtaining justice for them, and prosecuting corruption, and stamping all of this out. Again, it is laudable, and at the time that this happened, his efforts were not in vain. Because of the investigation that he led, President Park Geun-hye was impeached in December of 2016. Fast forward several months, and in May of 2017, President Moon Jae-in would go and appoint Yoon to be the chief of the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office. Once he was in this position, he was able to indict both former presidents, Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. Along with this, he would also prosecute 3 former National Intelligence Service directors, a former Chief Justice, and more than 100 other government officials and business executives. That is already pretty impressive, but one has to understand, because I know that I've talked about this before when it comes to Korea and just how messy things can be with their whole chaebol system with economics. He even had the balls to go and investigate accounting fraud at Samsung, which, if anyone knows anything with South Korea, the chaebol conglomerates basically run the country in the first place. This guy was an absolute beast when it came to rooting out corruption, and he wasn't even done yet. Fast forward 2 more years, and in July of 2019, Yoon was appointed to be the next prosecutor general, the highest legal position in all of South Korea, a position that is similar to the US Attorney General. His job, though, was to remain neutral and root out any government corruption, and he would immediately go to work. He would launch investigations against Minister of Justice Cho Kook, who was implicated in several scandals. He would then battle against repeated efforts to force him to resign, as he was a threat to people that were in power. This was mostly brought on by allies of Cho Kook, who were upset that he'd been investigated in the first place. At the time that all this was happening, there were also counterclaims that Yoon was just investigating anyone associated with Minister of Justice Chu Mi-ae, and this would lead to his suspension from his position in November of 2020. Now, that being said, Yoon never did resign, and this leads us up to 2021 and the presidential election that would occur that year. In March of 2021, Yoon resigned from his position as prosecutor general, and by June of that year, he announced that he himself was going to run for president. This was going to be the rise of his star. And now initially, he ran as an independent candidate, but within 2 weeks of launching his presidential campaign, he would go and join the Conservative People Power Party, or PPP. What happened next then, my friends, is one of the most interesting things that I can possibly think of. Yoon would go on to run one of the most haphazard presidential campaigns the world has probably ever seen. And by seen, I mean usually you would see the kind of things that were being said and done by less serious candidates who have no hope of winning. He would end up winning. And some of the things that this guy was saying were completely unhinged. What I mean by that is that this guy committed such blunders as advocating for, I'm not even kidding, a 120-hour work week. Yes, you heard me right. He advocated for people to work 120 hours, this being in comparison to President Moon's policy of a 52-hour work week. And that, of course, is in contrast to the one that is most commonly seen in America of the 40-hour work week. Yeah, we've talked before about issues when it comes to South Korea, Japan, China, and overwork. The South Koreans look at all those numbers and they go, haha, those are rookie numbers. We gotta pump them up. And he was arguably the most extreme version of that. In another incident, he would go and advocate for removing food safety standards because, according to his own opinion, quote, poor people should be allowed to eat substandard food for lower prices. Yeah, he was a interesting character for this, to say the least. Another thing that he would also say here during this time, that South Korea's low birth rate, which we've talked about here before in the past, this is something that is a very big problem for the country, that the reason it was happening was solely due to feminism and not the multiple factors that actually do contribute to it. Now, my friends, please understand, I am not trying to get into a social debate when I go and describe that. These are his own words that are used in this context. Like, that is what I am talking about here. If you want to know more about the South Korean birth crisis and how it's not just feminism that has created that problem, please go and check out that video that I did, because when you understand how people have to work in South Korea and what happens and the state of the economy, living expenses, education, and everything, and how it creates the issues in the first place, you would know that it's not just, oh, women have more rights, therefore people aren't having babies. There's no time, money, or energy for babies in the first place. So yeah, that was interesting enough, but then just days later after this, he would go and say in an interview that there was, quote, basically no radiation leak at the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan because, and quote, again, the reactors themselves didn't collapse. Now, I'm saying this right now, and I know a number of people are going to be pretty confused. We kind of scratched our heads over here at the channel trying to figure out what exactly he was referring to, and our best guess here is that he was referring to the plant's cooling towers, because, yeah, the cooling towers did not collapse. Sure, of course, yeah. But I guess this man thought that the radiation just didn't spread, which is not true. Arguably, this would have been one of the early red flags for him in the beginning, but still, despite many of these issues, he maintained his lead going into the presidential debates. In fact, it was actually at one of these debates that other candidates noticed that he had the Hanja character for king written on his left palm, which is a shamanistic talisman for good luck. And his opponents, when they saw this, jumped on him for practicing shamanistic beliefs. And he then tried to play it off and say that, oh, it was one of his supporters who wrote the word on his palm and encouraged him to be confident like a king during the debate. Yeah, sure, it totally wasn't, just a very commonly known shamanistic symbol. It was just a well-meaning random person that he met earlier that day for the first time that just wrote it on his hand and then he forgot to wash it off, right before one of the biggest debates of his entire life. The entire thing just kind of reeks of Yoon getting caught doing something and then making up poor excuses instead of just owning up to his own religious beliefs and practices. He didn't want to be embarrassed, I guess. Either way, going into October of 2021, Yoon would round out his controversial primary run by making some casual and positive statements about former military dictator of South Korea, Chun Do-hwan. And this, my friends, is a bad sign because of who exactly Chun Do-hwan is, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. This was arguably another red flag, and Yoon would later apologize for his remarks, but again, it was kind of apparent at this point that he did admire strongman tactics. Moving on from that, in early November of 2021, Yoon would officially win the nomination of the PPP for the 2022 election. 2 days later, he would go and state that if he won the presidency, that what he was going to do was that he was going to pardon both former presidents who, mind you, remember when we described this here earlier, his own investigations had put in jail. Yes, my friends, that's right. If that sounds confusing, both Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye were serving long corruption sentences that Yoon himself had helped to verify and prosecute. And now he was just going to pardon them if he became president. If this sounds suspicious and a hint of something darker in the future to come, yeah, it does really seem to be that way. Fast forward a few months later, and in March of 2022, he would go and narrowly win the presidency. Yoon would win 48.56% of the votes, in comparison to his opponent, Lee Jae-myung, who would obtain 47.83%. This was a very narrow victory that he secured, and his first announcement should have surprised no one by how weird it was. When he won, he said screw tradition, basically, and announced that he was going to run his presidency out of the Ministry of National Defense building in Yongsan, Seoul, instead of the Blue House, which had been the traditional residence of South Korea's presidents for the past 74 years. After this whole thing, he would then go and attempt to increase the work week in Korea from 52 hours to 69 hours per week, which, yes, this is very different from the 120 that he said at one point. I get that, but still one has to understand if the average work week is supposed to be 40 hours here, like in the United States, and in many places in Europe, it's more like 35, we're talking about something that is double. For any of my European friends that may be watching this, this is over double the amount of work that is typically done in Europe, and that would be the standard. That's what he wanted. As one can imagine, this would experience widespread resistance, considering what people have already been dealing with in South Korea. Again, if you want to go watch my birth crisis video, that kind of explains everything, but I'm going to need to do a dedicated economic video here on Korea as it is. In fact, the pressure was so great from the people that he had to back down from this idea. Next, in another questionable move, in July of 2022, Yoon would go and toss around the idea of starting a police bureau, this being something to have greater oversight over the nation's police forces. Essentially, what he wanted to do was he wanted to spy on the police and gather incriminating information against them in order to potentially blackmail them into doing his bidding. Now, this was taken by nearly everybody as a near dictator-level move, which is something that honestly is kind of similar to what we've covered with other places here in the past, as this would be something to attempt to compromise the neutrality of the police and bend them to favor Yoon and his party. In response to this, police chiefs from around the country would protest with their departments. Yoon would then threaten to punish them for protesting, which is kind of wild considering that he didn't actually ever go through with his plan of establishing the police bureau in the first place. He just threatened them if they went against it. There is more that happens after this, but my friends, we're going to fast forward by about 2 more years, because this is where things get very questionable. See, in 2024, the elections of South Korea would take place, and the opposition party, the Democratic Party of Korea, would win in an absolute landslide. Considering everything that had been happening in South Korea up to this point with his presidency and party, it is something that likely upset many different people, and as such, Yoon's own PPP party won only 108 seats, while the DPK, the Democratic Party, would win 175 seats. This was a massive loss, and in an act of defiance that one could argue was more like a kid throwing a tantrum when they lose a game on their iPad, President Yoon would refuse to appear at the opening session of the new National Assembly. He was not going to play with the new kids. And for anyone wondering how serious this potentially is, yeah, this was the first time a president had not appeared at the opening session of the National Assembly since the country restored democracy in 1988. As for what his excuse was, yeah, he had his office put out a statement that the National Assembly, quote, overissues demands for special prosecutor investigations and impeachments. Yeah, that's right. The complete about face for President Yoon was now complete. The man whose job it was to run special prosecutor investigations and enforce the rule of law was now railing against those who were attempting to do their job because he didn't like how many times impeaching him was brought up or proposed. Now, when I say that, the whole comparison to a toddler throwing a temper tantrum doesn't seem so strange now, does it? So then, how have the South Korean people responded to the rule of President Yoon up to this past week? Well. Not well at all. 3 months into his term, his approval rating was already below 30%. By August of 2024, it had dropped to 19%. His economic and foreign policies were highly unpopular, and his lack of communication about his intentions was seen as one of the primary reasons for his drop in popularity. I'm not wearing the shirt right now, but wait, it gets worse. Because at this point now, we've caught up to the events of the last week, this being where Yoon called martial law into effect. Now, part of the reasons thought to contribute to this choice include the fact that his wife received a Louis Vuitton handbag as a gift that was worth over $1,500, which broke a law against the president or his family receiving gifts over a certain value. Now, Yoon didn't want the National Assembly looking into this, as well as other suspicions around him, so he apparently called martial law in the hopes that he could prevent it from happening. Essentially, the martial law order ended up being the worst attempt at a coup that we have seen so far this century. And I'm not kidding about that. There have been many different things that we have covered, and this by far is probably the worst. See, this order for martial law set off a massive response from the public, with thousands of Koreans flooding into the streets and heading to the island where the National Assembly building is located. People of all ages began showing up on site, where they encountered soldiers surrounding the building and preventing anyone from getting inside. When I describe that, these soldiers had already broken windows in order to be able to get into the building in the first place. Police vehicles had already barricaded the front gate, and amongst the crowd were 190 members of the 300-member National Assembly. This was all the members of the National Assembly, aside from those in the PPP who did not show up, that being Yoon's own party. So yes, as I said, people were upset. The crowds began chanting for the order of martial law to be lifted, as well as calling for Yoon's resignation. The situation became even more surreal when the leader of the main opposition party, the DPK, was seen on live stream, and I'm not even kidding. This person live streamed jumping a fence on the backside of the building in order to be able to go and get inside. That is something that you can actually watch right now, and I'm pretty sure we can go and put up a video of it happening right now. As parliamentarians scrambled to get inside the National Assembly building to reverse the emergency measure, a woman in a leather coat would go and confront one of the soldiers who was trying to stop the lawmakers. When this happened, she would grab his automatic rifle and try to tug it away from him while yelling, "Aren't you ashamed?" The soldier would pull away from her, and as he backed away, he raised the barrel of the rifle, pointing it directly at her chest. Then, showing a massive amount of courage, this woman would then go and grab the barrel of the rifle, point it back at her own chest, while still yelling at him. The soldier in this video would then decide that the scenario simply was not worth it, likely due to multiple cameras that were present and pointed at him, and from there turned around to walk away. The person that I'm describing here at this time, the woman in the coat, was An Gui-yong, a 35-year-old former TV news anchor who had joined Lee Jae-myung's DPK party in 2022 as a spokesperson. She had previously run for office as a representative of the Dobong district of Seoul in early 2024, but at that time she didn't win office. When questioned about her bravery in the face of danger, she would simply reply with, quote, "The citizens who couldn't enter the National Assembly were outside, blocking the armored vehicles and showing such courage. So I didn't think my actions were particularly special or braver than anyone else's." That, my friends, is insane. But so while the actual members of the National Assembly were sneaking in the building from the back, An and the other protesters were on the front side of the building running distraction. They were attempting to keep the soldiers busy while the vote to rescind martial law was going to take place. An would later go and recount the moment as such, quote, "I was scared because I'm just a human. But as I said, the thought that we must stop them was stronger than my fear. I didn't feel it was real because armed soldiers with guns entering the National Assembly? I thought it was ridiculous. I didn't know what might happen next. I couldn't let my guard down." But in the end, my friends, amazingly, the strategy worked, and just after 1 a.m., the vote to rescind martial law was passed unanimously by all 190 members who were present. At that point, this would begin the wait for Yoon to revoke his order, which, mind you, legally was required if the National Assembly voted on it. An hour or two would pass with no activity, no news, no word of an agreement with the South Korean parliament. Yoon was playing dumb and acting like he hadn't heard the news or something. So Parliament would go and have a special copy of the law printed and run over to the president personally. Yoon would then go and drag his feet about going and rescinding the order for a little while longer, and after an emergency meeting with his cabinet, where they presumably asked him what the hell is he actually doing, Yoon finally lifted the order for martial law. The next morning would come, and many South Koreans would wake up in shock to see what had happened, since many of them were not even aware that any of this had happened. They had simply gone to bed, and then the late-night television announcement went on, the protest took place, and most people were sleeping through the entire thing. This, as you can imagine, created quite a stir. And for many of you, the unanswered question is probably, how did all of this get wrapped up so quickly? Well, my friends, that's because in all his reckless planning for the martial law order, Yoon managed to forget the South Korean people's history with martial law. And for that, we need to look back at history for context and also as a hint as to what could happen next. Normally in my videos, I would talk about context and history earlier, but in this case, this kind of format was arguably more necessary. Martial law was first decreed in South Korea in 1948 by then-President Ri after government forces faced a communist-led military rebellion. Ri, who was president for 12 years, would impose it again in 1952. In all, martial law has been declared in South Korea at least 16 times, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It is not exactly a rare thing for the country, which many people nowadays do not realize. The most famous and deadly instance of martial law being declared would definitely, though, be the last time it happened in 1980. And for that, let me explain the lead up to this incident, as it would become a national holiday in Korea years later. Basically, the context of this is that Park Chung-hee had assumed military rule over the country as head of a military junta in 1962. He did so promising to install true democracy. Oddly enough, Chung-hee's daughter, Park Geun-hye, would later become president and would actually be prosecuted by Yoon Suk-yeol, the current president of South Korea, in his earlier days as prosecutor, so there is all kinds of irony when we go and talk about this. At the time that this happened, the Kennedy administration had put serious pressure on the South Korean leadership, stating that a military dictatorship was highly inadvisable. So to keep up appearances, Park had an election organized and barely beat the previous president, Yoon Po-sun, by just over 156,000 votes, or 1.5% of the total vote. Park Chung-hee would then run the country just like a military dictator anyway, though, and the man was a serious Japanophile. Like, this guy loved anything and everything Japanese, it seems, which, honestly, when we go and describe that, is very odd, since the countries have historically had a lot of bad blood since the Japanese went and occupied Korea for decades prior to and throughout World War II. But much of Korea's economic turnaround during this time could be dubbed the Miracle on the Han River, and can be assigned to his attempts to copy the Japanese economic miracle. Which, on that note, if you'd like to learn more about the Japanese economic miracle, then you are in luck. We actually did an episode about it a few months back here on this channel, and you can check that one out as well. Dear God, it's all tying together. Anyway, so Park Chung-hee had a strong grip on Korea throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The Johnson and Nixon administration were silent about the whole situation in South Korea because Park made sure that South Korea sent the most troops to Vietnam of any country aside from the US. Park simply saw this as him getting the opportunity to have his army trained in combat next to the strongest military in the world. And he still ruled over his country with the strictness of an autocratic dictator. Fast forward a bit of time, and in 1975, in preparation for South Korea's bid to host the 1988 Olympic Games, he would go and order police to cleanse the streets and expel any beggars, vagrants, and street vendors who gave the country a bad image abroad. Yeah, this essentially became a social cleansing program against the most vulnerable and lowest status members of Korean society. Thousands of people were swept up by police and sent to 36 work camps. There, they were subjected to forced labor, torture, and repeated intimate violations. Yes, the thing that I'm not allowed to say here on YouTube. Eventually, over 16,000 South Koreans would end up in these camps, and officially, 513 people died of, quote, exhaustion in the camps. But we can't exactly verify this number in the least because, well, it's likely many times higher, and many things have been lost to history. See, the funny thing is, regimes tend to stop keeping strict records when it comes to committing crimes against humanity, and the South Korean leadership of this time certainly fit that category. Really, one can argue that the only thing that kept Park Chung-hee in power for so long was the fact that South Korea was economically booming during this time. The growth that his country was achieving was insane. People wanted the economy to succeed so badly that they essentially voted to keep a dictator in power because that was one of the things allowing it to happen. Park would deny freedom of speech and the press during his rule, and this led the populace to slowly simmer and boil over with anger in 1979. That would lead to massive student protests in October of 1979, where up to 50,000 South Koreans showed up pissed off and angry. 2 days later, Park again declared martial law. Violence would spread throughout the streets, resulting in citywide curfews in multiple cities. Now, at this point, you would expect violence to begin to spread all over the place, and to a degree, you would be right, except the primary target of this violence ended up not being the Korean people. No, it was Park Chung-hee himself. On October 26th, he would be assassinated by his own director of intelligence. This was a man who was a friend and confidant who had helped him get into power in the first place. And it was this act that then began to spawn the formation of several democracy movements amongst the South Korean populace. Because, my friends, in the following 6 months, Major General Chun Doo-hwan would go and form another military junta, and they would take control of the country in a swift coup known as the coup d'etat of May 17th. In one of the most deft political schemes of all time, Chun had been placed in charge of the investigation into the assassination of Park Chung-hee. And he's the guy that did it in the first place. So yeah, Chun Doo-hwan would take full advantage of his position and went to the Korean CIA and told them that since their leader had killed the president, they were all suspect and under investigation. He then leveraged that to make a secret cabinet of his own, and together they, took control of the Korean CIA and manipulated the system to where Chun Doo-hwan was officially made director of it. During all this time, he was promoted to general, the highest rank in the Korean military. At this point, he now held control of the country's military and intelligence agency. As one could probably imagine, his first move was to institute a nationwide martial law. He took this opportunity to begin to take out his enemies. Then, he used his position as director of the Korean CIA by saying that intelligence reports indicated a North Korean plot to take advantage of South Korean civil unrest in order to conduct an invasion of South Korea. This meant that he would be able to pretty much do whatever it is that he wanted in the name of protecting the country. Years later, declassified documents would prove that the KCIA had found no such plans at all, and the Korean people had enough by this point. In a response, in Gwangju, the citizens of that city would go and form the Gwangju Democratization Movement, which sounds like a political party, but in reality, the GDM was a revolutionary militia. Chun realized the danger to his regime and immediately ordered the group to be shut down, which would lead to the infamous Gwangju Uprising. This would end up becoming South Korea's Tiananmen Square uprising, and May 18th is still now a holiday to this day. To explain this, on May 18th, 1980, groups of students began to gather at Cheonan National University, protesting its closure due to the most recent martial law order that had been put in place. Now, the reason the nation's colleges and universities were even closed in the first place is because Chun Doo-hwan knew that these were hotbeds for anti-government protest movements. Typically, historically, intellectuals have been that. First, it was 200 students up against 30 paratroopers. During the morning, the soldiers would charge the students who pulled back, and the fighting would move into downtown Gwangju. More people began to show up, and eventually there would be 1,500 protesters, most of them university students, facing off against nearly 700 soldiers in the streets. In preparations for such an event, Chun Du-hwan had ordered the training of a special selection of paratroopers a few months prior. This severe riot control training was referred to as loyalty training, and the soldiers were treated brutally by their trainers, which they then took out on the protesters in the streets during the Gwangju uprising. Basically, the soldiers began clubbing anyone within their reach indiscriminately. They would use their bayonets to attack and torture anyone who got too close. They raided buildings that didn't even house protesters, such as hotels and cafes. A barbershop was destroyed during this time for no reason. What's fascinating is that some of these buildings are, to this very day, kept just as they were that day. There are now museums to the uprising with forensic analysis listed, with bullet holes still in the walls as proof of the government's actions. The May 18th National Cemetery would later be open to provide a final resting place for those who would die in the subsequent days. Because yes, there would be deaths. The first known fatality from the event was a deaf man by the name of Kim Gyong-chol. This unfortunate person was simply watching the events unfold before he was brutally clubbed to death. The next day, thousands of more protesters would show up in the streets. From there, the conflict would get messier. The army was now opening fire on civilians with their guns, killing an unknown number of people. The protesters would respond by burning down the local TV station for spreading misinformation. Someone even approached a police barricade at high speed, ramming into and killing 4 policemen with a vehicle. On the night of May 20th, a parade of taxis and buses would show up at the provincial office in solidarity with the protesters. Even though this parade was entirely nonviolent, soldiers would fire tear gas on the parade and then pull people out of their vehicles to begin beating them. Like, these guys even went and assaulted taxi drivers that were trying to rush wounded people to hospitals, and many people were shot. All of this then, my friends, would culminate with the protesters breaking into a local Army Reserve unit armory and stealing numerous M1 rifles and even a pair of light machine guns that they used to light up the soldiers with. The military would pull out to the city's outskirts and from there blockade it. They then called in helicopters and began to spray the crowd with high-caliber machine gun fire. These helicopter attacks were later proven to have taken place on the 19th and 20th of May. If you think that it is serious by this point, my friends, then yes, it is, but then Chun Du-hwan got real serious and called in reinforcements for the army. On May 27th, 1980, soldiers would go and execute Operation Martialism and Loyalty. Armed with M16s and stun grenades, they wore uniforms that were stripped of identifying information and unit insignia or patches. From there, 3 airborne brigades were the first to strike, followed in and supported by elements from the 20th Mechanized Infantry Division and the 31st Infantry Division. These would storm the city and wipe out the civilian militias in less than 90 minutes, exercising extreme brutality and lethal force. When I say that, my friends, there is no universally accepted death toll for the Gwangju uprising. Depending on who you ask, you can get figures ranging from the government's laughably low 144 dead and roughly 400 wounded, to the more realistic estimates of between 1,000 to 2,000 dead and between 1,800 and 3,500 wounded. Some people simply just disappeared, much the same way as people did at Tiananmen Square in 1989 in China, but no one talks about this in South Korea like they talk about things with China. Altogether, more than 200,000 people participated in the protest, facing roughly 3,000 paratroopers and over 18,000 police officers. In the end, this thing was truly insane, and the reason that the events of the Gwangju uprising resonate so strongly with the people of South Korea is that this would plant the seeds of numerous other democracy movements that eventually built up pressure on the government over the next decade. So much pressure that it essentially forced the government into instituting reforms in the late 1980s. And in 1997, President Kim Dae-jung would take office as the first truly and democratically elected president from any opposition party, signaling a true switch to democracy for South Korea. It sounds truly crazy, my friends, because when a lot of us think of South Korea, we think of a democracy. We think of one of the oldest democracies in Asia that has been supported specifically by the United States. But no, for the majority of its history, South Korea basically would oscillate between different dictatorships. And that is going back as soon as the 1980s. As you can imagine, things are fresh in people's mind to this day. So, flashback to the events of early December 2024, when Yoon Suk-yeol would institute martial law. Many of South Korean citizens were quickly and hauntingly reminded of the Gwangju uprising and just how much South Korea had to suffer to achieve real democracy. Some of those who took to the streets of Seoul were even there and took part in the uprising some 44 years ago. The thing is, when the last time your country was under martial law ended with that kind of violence, you can guarantee that being under martial law again was going to raise quite a bit of alarm. That is why people acted so bravely. That is why they resisted the soldiers. The example set for them by the bravery of those who fought and died for democracy in May of 1980 is still something that is seared into the collective consciousness of much of South Korea today. They were not going to let it happen again. So, one may then wonder, what happened to President Yoon? Well, the martial law order went into effect on December 3rd, a Tuesday night. By the morning of December 4th, a large portion of his staff would resign. This included his chief of staff, Jung Jin-suk, and his minister of defense, Kim Yong-hyun. On December 7th, Yoon would issue an apology for his actions following widespread criticism. By Saturday of the same week, the National Assembly had received over a half dozen requests for impeachment charges to be brought up against Yoon. You would expect at this point that he would be done for. And you know what? It didn't happen. No, my friends, what happened instead, and when I say this, I'm going to use very harsh language, and normally when I try to describe things with politics, I try to be as neutral as possible. This is something that I can definitively say was a very stupid move on the part of the PPP, because at this point it seems that they've just committed political suicide. With the exception of 3 members of the party, the entire PPP party stood up and walked out, refusing to vote. The rest of the National Assembly still held the vote, and so it failed, because it was 195 votes to impeach to 0. It wasn't the 200 that they needed. Yoon's party had failed his people, but he survived getting impeached. At this point, you can pretty much guarantee that if he wants to become another dictator, President Yoon will likely face stiff opposition by those who still remember the sacrifices of those who died in the Gwangju uprising. And simultaneously, people remember his failed coup, martial law, whatever it is that you would like to describe it as. And that is where we are still then currently. President Yoon is still in office, at least for the meantime. His party protected him with inaction, and he could still implement martial law again at literally any point, although he has now promised that he won't do so. How will the Korean people respond now? Well, only time will tell. And at that point, we will go and keep you updated should anything happen. Oh, hey, yeah, guys, sorry about the interruption here, but this is now going up way later than I thought it would because it took a lot longer for this whole thing to get edited. But yeah, things have changed since then. South Korea's parliament would, a week later, actually vote to impeach President Yoon. The National Assembly would actually manage to pass the motion by a vote of 204 to just 85? And so Yoon's presidential powers were subsequently suspended. That did happen. Now at this point, the Constitutional Court has 180 days in order to determine whether or not they are going to reinstate his power as president, or whether he is officially going to be kicked out of office. In which case, a national election has to be held within 60 days of that decision, so we will see how this all goes. Now, at the time that I'm actually making this update, which is literally a half day later from the point in which all of this was going down, thousands of Yoon supporters have been protesting in the streets, while at the same time, thousands of counter-protesters against him have also been protesting in the street. The entire thing has gotten extremely messy. But as it stands, even though his presidential powers have been removed, he is still technically in office. But at the same time, Yoon has not exactly complied with various different summons by authorities that are investigating whether or not, his martial law order was justified or whether it constituted insurrection by virtue of the Constitution. And he hasn't really responded to any attempts by the courts to contact him, so we will really see how that whole thing goes. The coming weeks will likely determine everything. Rest assured, though, considering the events that have taken place, the next round of political elections within South Korea are likely to be interesting, to say the least. But that is the end of things here today. Remember, my friends, please share, like, and subscribe, as it truly does help us here in the algorithm. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out our Patreon, where you can get extra content for as little as $1 a month. That is where we put a lot of bonus episodes up for the actual podcast, and we have links for merch down below. Thank you very much for watching, my friends, and I will see you all here later. Goodbye, everyone.